Get ready for an electrifying night of classical music as the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra presents Prokofiev's prowess. Guest pianist Ilya Yakushev brings fire and energy to Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 3. The night opens with the graceful wit of Mozart's Symphony No. 27 and closes with Bizet's joyful Symphony in C. Join the WCO on Friday, January 30th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are available at wcoconcerts.org/Prokofiev. Want to win the Madison Summer Camp Rush? Behold Wonder Palette Camp. The local creative art camp in Middleton at Sauk Trail Elementary is open for registration. Campers ages 6 to 12 will find an energetic and supportive environment to explore their creative passions. They offer 4 separate weeks of camp, each unique, and each week has 4 days of fun in the culinary arts, arts and crafts, theater, and dance. Register today at wonderpaletecamp.com. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, does Madison need to prepare itself for the AI data center revolution? The mayor and the majority of the Madison Common Council think so. Earlier this month, the council approved placing a 1-year pause on the city approving any new land use for data center proposals. I'm with one of the sponsors of that ordinance, Alder Derek Field, who represents Madison's District 3, covering a swath of Northeast Madison. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bianca, for having me. Excited to talk this morning.
Yeah, it's such an important topic, super spicy, and just crucial to the moment. So why vote to pause the construction and approval of new data centers?
Yeah, so I think if we've been paying attention to the news, we see proposals for a lot of data centers coming up now, and really big ones at that. Madison only has so much land, and so I think, to put it simply, we need to make sure we're respecting our long-term land use plans to make sure we're getting walkable neighborhoods and balancing Madison residents' different needs and those of the economy. That doesn't mean never or no data centers. That could mean data centers at some scale, some places, but that's exactly what we need to take a pause and study. We don't currently have a lot of tools on the books that we can use right now.
We love that. Thoughtful. Neighborhoods we like. Very important. So what exactly does this ordinance call for and contain?
So this ordinance is about putting a pause on new approvals for data centers if those data centers exceed 10,000 feet. That means data centers that are bigger than a Walgreens and where the data center is the primary use. So if there's a lab that needs servers to run their research, they can still build their lab. That's going to be a non-primary use. We're talking about a business that sets up with large bays of a lot of servers. Those need a lot of land. They inevitably have some impact on power utilities, and that's a bigger question than just the city of Madison can study on its own. Right now, the county has a mirroring process. They are taking a regional look at where and what scale of data centers may be appropriate and what to do about it. Here in the city, and at least for my part in this, I view this primarily as a land use concern, because there are some zoning districts around the city where right now data centers could have been granted before the moratorium, where now we've kind of put a pause on that to keep it from happening while we study more rules that help us target where data centers could go and what size they could be.
What is the city hoping to accomplish in this year of moratorium? Like theoretically, in a year from now, next January, what do y'all hope will be in place?
Yes, the first and I think the most important thing here is going to be defining a data center. The zoning code doesn't even have a definition of data center on the books. Right now, the data centers that operate in Madison, at least under the reformed zoning code since 2013, have been judged on the basis of being a telecommunications center. So we need to distinguish between a true telecommunications center and a data center in the zoning code. And then from there, determine where data centers, that new use we need to make, would be allowed. I think 30-some zoning districts that apply to property across Madison, and determining which ones, based on their proximity to neighborhoods, their proximity to highways and industrial areas, or to schools and shopping centers, which ones would be appropriate for a building that houses a data center. Data centers are not necessarily an activated use, right? They don't have a lot of windows or storefronts. At least that's kind of my current conception of them. But I think that's why we need to take time to study to see if there are different ways we could shape a data center that is appropriate for a mixed use area. Then there's, of course, the question of size. We would need to be very, very thoughtful and cautious before agreeing to allow a lot of land to be developed as a data center, given that we're still hoping to add housing and develop new neighborhoods to house new neighbors.
Yep, I've heard about that process and hope.
Yes, and I'm not sure a data center is the most neighborhood serving use we could allow there.
You know, it's not something that folks were even talking about a few years ago, but Madison already has data centers, right?
Right.
Can you talk about what the current landscape looks like in terms of data centers? And then also a little bit about the difference between the telecommunication centers versus data center.
Yes, Madison has a handful of data centers that, as far as I'm aware, have been great neighbors operating without a problem. Crucially, too, they offer property value and therefore they contribute to the city's tax levy and help pay for and support taxes that Madison residents benefit from. And so I want to acknowledge that that is a benefit to the community, and data centers are not inherently evil by any means. But that's where we need to be able to distinguish between the scale and the neighborhood impacts of a new data center. Your question about telecommunications centers is an interesting one because I think I'm not personally very familiar with what a telecommunication center could be. I think we need to write a flexible definition that covers more technological change because, frankly, that's just inevitable. We just saw it happen with considering data centers as telecommunication centers, but now the economy has pushed data centers off into kind of their own category where they behave differently and the investment patterns are different. Certainly, that's why we need to give our staff some breathing room to study this and figure it out.
Yeah, is Madison even a desirable location for new data centers considering we have limited land? I mean, we have lots of water, but you're seeing a lot of data centers going to largely rural areas.
Madison also has a really highly skilled workforce and a pretty diversified workforce. And so I think that that makes the construction of and the operation of data centers here a little more attractive than some parts of the country. Also, the availability of electricity is going to be a key possible constraint for new data centers. And I just read the Wisconsin Policy Forum's brief. They compiled a research brief using data, publicly available data through the Public Service Commission and Wisconsin's power utilities that show there's evidence of some capacity in Wisconsin's electrical grid. And so there may be the possibility that utilities can continue to provide power and more power even to new data centers. Even though our population has been growing, the loss of some manufacturing facilities and the improving efficiency of the devices we use in our lifestyle has meant that we're consuming less power per capita. That brief was a really helpful way to think about the power side of this. Again, that's certainly outside the scope of the city of Madison's legislation.
You guys don't run the grid.
Yeah, absolutely.
You said at the top of this conversation that if this moratorium was not approved or put forward, that there are actually already data center proposals underway looking for space in Madison. Can you tell me about what we know about those proposals? And I wasn't even sure if there were people interested, if this was hypothetical, but it's not. There are folks sniffing around these waters.
Yep. City staff have been fielding some questions about data centers and data center-like uses around Madison. I'm not familiar with a filed application right now, and the moratorium gives us time before the city would have to consider a new application for approval.
And the moratorium had, a lot of support, but did y'all hear any dissenting voices to the pause? And if so, what were their objections?
Yes, the representatives from Madison's business community spoke out on this one, engaged some of the alders privately, spoke at the Plan Commission, and spoke at the Common Council. At first, asking for time, asking for a referral to the Economic Development Committee. And then by the time the resolution got to council, their membership had considered a position and decided to oppose the moratorium. They shared their concerns that the moratorium sends the wrong message to investors, to businesses who may be looking at investing in Madison. And they raise what I think are fair points about the importance of investing in property in Madison and the benefits to the community that has when those properties are then paying into the property tax levy and supporting residents' services. A good example is property taxes from data centers and other non-residential uses support the library fund, but they don't necessarily generate more demand on the libraries themselves, right? So that, those are certainly fair points to consider on the importance of these as investments. But I think the reason that the Plan Commission and the Common Council both unanimously supported this resolution is that while those are good points, there are also points that raise concern with us about data centers' popularity now and the interest in many data centers, possibly. Certainly, that's what we're seeing around the state of Wisconsin.
The demand.
Yes, the demand for data centers. Yep.
It's interesting because, I was wondering if this moratorium was intended to send a message to private industry partners or potential partners that Madison's taking development of data centers really seriously and will be going into any new partnerships really clear-eyed.
It's certainly fair. We're going to be careful with what rules we use to judge data centers, and we'll spend the next 12 months developing those rules. I also think this should send a message about the city's priorities, and those priorities being in the direction of housing and livable neighborhoods. So I hope that's a message to Madison residents, too, that we care about what goes into your neighborhoods and that those be neighborhood-serving uses to grow strong, healthy communities. And a message that we are committed to supporting Madison's broader economic growth and the growth in the workforce and the number of families who move here and live here.
I'm sure there are plenty of folks, and this is candidly my first trigger gut instinct when I think about data center development in Madison. They're like, no way, not here. Get yourself packing. We don't need ugliness and polluting blights here. It's a super NIMBY attitude. And I think I come by a lot of that sentiment, honestly. But also there's this question about if not here, then where? And you said data centers are not evil. We have data centers here. Is there a non-detrimental way for our city to take part of the load of the internet's infrastructure here in Madison? Whether we like it or not, we're using a lot of cloud storage ourselves. Or maybe the sentiment is, of course, we're going to use data centers. We just need to go about it the right way.
Yep, I think it's more the latter. Of course, we'll have some data centers, and we need to make sure that they work with what Madison wants to be. An example of what that might look like that we discussed a little bit at the council meeting before adopting the resolution is treating differently the large data centers from the small data centers, and maybe allowing some of those small data centers and those data centers that are non-primary uses in more places than we are willing to allow the large data centers, right? And maybe there's a limit on how large a data center can be if you want to set up in Madison and use land in Madison for a data center.
In addition to being an alder, you're also a policy analyst at UW-Madison. I know those are two separate parts of your life, but being an innovative city, looking over at UW, they've been majorly positioning themselves to be a flagship for developing AI ethically with the humanities in mind, investing millions of dollars into that work. And I just saw that UW-Madison has a partnership looking to use fusion, a developing technology in physics, to be a potential power source for the massive energy needs that this time and age require. Considering our local brain power here, is Madison actually well positioned to be a leader around data centers and doing it the right way? How do we approach this well?
I think that's exactly what we're looking for, is for Madison to study the issue pretty thoughtfully, including stakeholder engagement and reaching out to thought partners who are solid partners on stuff like this, including the university, and figure out how to do data centers in a way that still supports a vibrant and growing urban environment. It is certainly a reality that AI and AI tools based in our software are an unavoidable part of life now and are dramatically changing how we interact with tools on the internet, with data, for example, in my day job. Those are going to change the economy, and that will require rethinking how we process all of the information, what infrastructure supports all of these changes. Madison will be involved in it, absolutely. The broader community has a lot of brain trust here. The Dane County Regional task force on data centers, I think, is going to be a really good place to have this conversation at more of a regional, high level with lots of stakeholder engagement, partners at the table, and the city of Madison will certainly be involved in that.
And we're not the only game in town. Our neighbor to the north of us, DeForest, is underway with a data center proposal process. A lot of eyes on that right here in Dane County. And several, other high-profile data centers proposed and approved across Wisconsin, Janesville, Port Washington. Is the city learning anything from watching those discussions and debates?
I can tell you from my perspective, and as a sponsor of the resolution, I certainly am. I'm watching. I'm seeing what those communities decide to do and how their residents react. My Alder district also includes a lot of land that's not yet developed, that is currently mapped out for new neighborhoods and nodes of mixed use activity and employment areas. And so that's why I'm taking very seriously some of the proposals that we see coming up in the news. And it is some of those bigger ones that have caused me concern, because those at that scale are not necessarily consistent with how we envision the future of Madison to grow, including in my East Side district.
Well, I wonder if slowing down the process, even for a year, might have Madison really losing out financially. What were the determinations around that? Like, are we losing a ton of money? What's the picture?
Well, given that we don't have any applications right now under consideration for a new data center, I don't think we're fending anything off immediately. There is probably a risk that if we had a permanent freeze, we would be losing out on some tax base that helps support city services. Those who live in the city pay property taxes. And if there are properties that come onto the tax rolls and add to the tax base, that kind of allows services to expand for everybody. I think 12 months is not at all an unreasonable amount of time to take in the scale of how long it takes to develop these properties. And because we want to get the job done right, we don't want to be rushing through a sloppy process or copying how it worked somewhere else that may not be what works in Madison. Well, I certainly think it's fair to raise those points and have a discussion about the impacts. Ultimately, every member of the Plan Commission and every member of the Common Council voted in favor of the resolution, those who were in attendance.
A lot of pushback that we hear about data centers coming to places is concern around pollution. So we talked about the electrical grid. We have waters. I'm just going to speak extremely selfishly, and I know I'm not alone, but one of my biggest concerns in Madison is having clean lakes. Our beautiful lakes, one of the great reasons to live here, and how much effort the city and, local organizations put in cleaning the lakes from pollution, from farm runoff and all of that. What thought do we have in terms of data centers as possible polluters and how to mitigate that? How is that being taken into account?
Yeah, I think that's something we still need to explore. Data centers, so impervious surface means rain that falls can't soak in there. It has to go somewhere else. And the city has some pretty strict rules in a new development that requires they retain a lot of rainwater on site there. And so that is generally something we do that helps the lakes in new developments. Above a certain amount of inches of rain, the rain's still going to run off. We can only require them to have so much capacity. So there could certainly be valid concerns about runoff from the rooftops or parking areas of data centers. I am personally more concerned about the carbon dioxide emissions from data centers adding demand for power from the grid, because some of our biggest utilities have scheduled the closure of their fossil fuel-based power generating plants. And if we begin to add more demand for electricity now above what had been projected, I'm a little concerned they're going to look to that as a reason to delay the closure of their plants. And I think we need to follow through on closing some of our coal plants in Wisconsin. In the Madison area, I'm not too concerned about direct emissions from the data centers themselves. As far as I'm aware, I don't think they combust anything beyond the HVAC system they use to regulate the building temperatures. For me, I think our local concern is the lakes and runoff, as you said, but we have some pretty decent rules in place to deal with those right now.
Are there other kinds of ethical or just practical considerations coming up in conversation around the data center development at the city level we haven't touched on?
I view land use decisions in part as weighing the opportunity cost of using land for something instead of something else. And so I think we need to be careful when talking about a category of land uses that isn't for housing in neighborhoods. We need to make sure that those are placed in the right areas of the city. My bigger concerns about data centers right now are that they are permitted uses in the zoning code in the commercial corridor and commercial corridor transitional zoning districts. Those are very common zoning districts all over the city, right in neighborhoods and in neighborhood centers. Those zoning districts could be what your local gas station or your local grocery store or retail businesses near your neighborhood use. And so being a permitted use means that if a landowner files an application to build something there, it is a staff administrative review process without a public hearing. And staff will be making sure that the proposal follows the ordinances, but there won't be any discretionary opportunity for officials or residents to examine and then weigh in on a proposal. That's what permitted by right means. And so with those zoning districts being all over the city, that's where we become concerned about data centers larger in scale, taking land that could be used for other things and locking them in place for this instead.
And you know Madisonians have opinions.
Absolutely they do, yes, and they should. We all want to weigh in on how our neighborhoods work for us, and this is in part a way to make sure we can do that.
Is this something you've talked to your constituents about? Have you heard any concerns?
I had a conversation with some neighborhood leaders in my district east of the interstate, and their neighborhood has a lot of yet undeveloped land around them that is mapped for new neighborhoods. I brought up that we were talking about this moratorium resolution and heard a lot of support, that they'd appreciate the opportunity to see what the city's thinking and new and more specific rules about data centers. And they live by vacant land where data centers could go. So of course, I think they are really interested in seeing what we come up with in these rules. I've shared in a couple of posts and have gotten some feedback in web form responses to those posts in support of the data centers resolution. I think most Madison residents who've weighed in on this are pretty eager to see this process play out and make sure we're very careful about where data centers will go.
Okay, well, this has been so informative, Derek. Before I let you go, is there anything else you want to leave Madison and our surrounding communities to chew on before we part? Useful considerations as we all continue to contend with this emerging market?
The last point I would just really want to enforce is that a moratorium doesn't mean never, because it's a temporary moratorium in this case, and that we're studying the issue. So nothing has been finalized yet. The next year will include the process for getting public feedback and studying and discussing in public hearings what the rules may look like. There will be a legislative process to adopt a new zoning code amendment that defines those rules, puts them in place, and establishes the process of reviewing data centers. So stay engaged. There's going to be a lot more going on in this topic.
All right, Alder Field, thank you so much for your time and insight. This has been very informative.
Thank you very much, Bianca.
That's Derek Field, Madison City Alder for District 3. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's show, why not share this episode with someone you know who's interested in the AI revolution and data center debates. Alrighty, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care and thanks for listening.